Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm about to share with you an incredibly powerful and eye-opening story about injustice, courage, and how one simple phone call changed everything. This is the story of a highly decorated U.S. Army general who found herself wrongfully detained by a racist cop, and the shocking turn of events that followed when she made one call to the Pentagon. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this ordinary situation quickly escalated into a career-ending mistake for the officer involved, and how it led to change that impacted not just one person, but an entire system. Why should you watch this? Well, this story is about more than just an unfair traffic stop. It's about the kind of power and strength we can find within ourselves when we stand up to injustice. It's about using your voice, your position, and your knowledge to challenge wrongdoings and make sure the right thing is done. Whether it's something you've experienced yourself or just a story you need to hear, I promise you'll walk away feeling inspired and empowered. And hey, if you've ever faced something similar or have a story that needs to be heard, don't hesitate to share it in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you, and who knows, maybe your story will be the next one we share on the channel. It was a typical afternoon in the small town of Fayetteville, Georgia, as a seasoned U.S. Army general named Sarah Thompson made her way down Highway 94, heading back from a visit to a military base. As she sat comfortably in her sleek black Jeep Grand Cherokee, her military-grade GPS on the dashboard was guiding her through the familiar, winding back roads. Despite her extensive experience, even someone like her, a decorated officer with decades of service, could lose her bearings when the roads shifted due to ongoing construction projects. General Sarah Thompson was used to the constant noise and chaos that came with serving in the military. She had seen the world, negotiated with foreign leaders, and led troops into war zones. She had earned the trust of her superiors, was respected by her peers, and held the rank of brigadier general, a position few women, let alone women of color, ever reached in the U.S. Army. Her life was built on discipline, focus, and an unwavering commitment to her country. But in that moment, none of that mattered. As she adjusted her GPS, blue and red lights flashed in her rearview mirror, pulling her out of her thoughts. The sound of the engine, the humming of traffic, and the quiet of the afternoon seemed to fade away as her attention shifted to the flashing lights behind her. With a quiet sigh, Sarah's mind didn't race, nor did her heart skip a beat. It wasn't fear she felt, but a deep, tired resignation. A feeling that Black Americans knew too well, especially in moments like these. She wasn't nervous about a traffic stop. She was, however, all too familiar with the weight of being treated as a suspect based solely on the color of her skin. The officer's voice echoed through her window as he barked the command, "Hands where I can see them." His tone was sharp and unnecessary, almost deliberately provocative. Sarah wasn't fazed. She slowly lowered the window and placed her hands on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions, the way she had been taught since the very first time she got behind the wheel. It was a subtle gesture, but one that spoke volumes about her experience. She wasn't about to give this officer any reason to escalate the situation, even if that meant hiding the frustration she was feeling deep inside. The officer approached her vehicle, his posture tense, hands hovering near his holster. "Ma'am, I need to see your license and registration," he demanded. His voice had already taken on a condescending edge, filled with an assumption that she was a threat. Sarah calmly complied, reaching into the glove compartment, her eyes never leaving the officer's face. Despite his rude demeanor, she remained composed, as though she were executing a well-practiced drill, something drilled into every soldier. "Nothing illegal about that," Sarah said, her voice cool but firm, her words carrying the weight of someone who had long learned the art of maintaining composure under pressure. But the officer didn't seem interested in hearing her explanation. Instead of accepting the documents and moving on, he scrutinized them briefly, his gaze lingering on the military ID. A flash of suspicion passed over his face and he stepped back. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered abruptly, his hands still near his gun, the threat lingering in his words. As Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door, she felt the growing tension in the air, the unmistakable sense of being wrongly targeted. She had been in more stressful situations than she cared to count, but this felt different. This wasn't a routine stop, and this officer wasn't interested in following procedure. He was only interested in asserting control over someone he saw as other. What Sarah didn't realize was that this encounter was about to become something far more significant than a simple misunderstanding. She wasn't just another civilian. She wasn't someone to be belittled or bullied into submission. The officer had no idea who he was dealing with, but she did, and she was prepared to show him. As the officer's demand hung in the air, Sarah remained calm. She knew the drill. She had dealt with tense situations in the battlefield, in high-stakes negotiations, and even in the halls of the Pentagon. But this was different. This wasn't a foreign adversary or a combatant on a mission. This was a moment of racial tension, a microcosm of a larger systemic issue that had plagued Black Americans for generations. Yet despite the mounting pressure, she refused to let the officer's hostility provoke her. "Do you have any weapons on you?" the officer asked, his voice laced with contempt, as if Sarah's mere presence in the vehicle was somehow a threat. Sarah turned slightly, showing her profile and raising her hands just enough to demonstrate that she wasn't concealing anything. "I'm active duty. My weapons are secured on base," she said, her voice steady and measured. The officer's face remained unreadable, but his eyes flickered with skepticism. "Oh, so now you're military?" he sneered, his tone dripping with disdain. "What? Are you a mechanic or something?" Sarah didn't respond to the taunt. She had long since learned the importance of choosing her battles, and this wasn't one she intended to fight with words. Instead, she silently handed over her military ID, hoping that the badge, the rank, the authority would finally get through to this officer. But Officer Mallory didn't seem interested in verifying her credentials. He barely looked at the ID, brushing it aside as if it were insignificant. He didn't even consider the possibility that the woman he was dealing with might be someone who outranked him. Not just a woman, but a general. A decorated officer who had served her country with honor. His mind was clouded by his own prejudice, and in that moment he couldn't see beyond the color of her skin. "I didn't ask for a lecture," he muttered dismissively, stepping away from the car and tapping his flashlight on the side of her vehicle, as though searching for anything at all, that could justify his behavior. Sarah's patience was running thin. The officer's actions weren't just an inconvenience, they were an insult, an abuse of authority. She could feel the eyes of passers-by on her, some of them filming the interaction. A sense of helplessness hung in the air, but Sarah wasn't about to be just another viral video. She had been trained for much worse than this, and this officer wasn't going to break her. The officer's radio crackled, and as he communicated with his dispatcher, the situation only grew more tense. He mentioned that he had a suspect who was uncooperative and probably lying about being military, as though Sarah's word wasn't enough. The crowd gathered, some expressing their confusion, others filming the encounter, but no one dared to intervene. Sarah knew better than to expect help. In moments like these, Black people often had to fight their own battles, especially when the system was working against them. As the officer's frustration grew, he suddenly barked, "Hands behind your back." And within seconds, Sarah felt the cold bite of handcuffs tighten around her wrists. The grip was harsh, the humiliation stark. Her mind remained sharp, but the anger simmered beneath the surface. How could anyone look at her, someone who had served her country so faithfully, and treat her like this? Despite the injustice, Sarah didn't resist. She didn't scream or fight back. She knew all too well that resistance could escalate the situation, and that wasn't a risk she was willing to take. Instead, she remained still, her body tense, her heart steady. She wasn't about to let this officer have the satisfaction of seeing her panic, but deep down, she knew that this was far from over. She had been humiliated in front of a crowd, detained without cause, and forced into a position where her own authority didn't matter. But she wasn't just going to be another statistic. As Sarah was pushed against the hood of her car, her mind was already turning, calculating her next move. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. She wasn't going to be silenced. And then, with quiet resolve, she spoke. "I'd like to make a phone call," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. As the officer moved to arrest Sarah, something inside her shifted. She had experienced the fog of chaos on the battlefield, the silent tension of diplomatic negotiations, and the unspoken weight of systemic racism in her country. But this moment, The injustice she was facing right here, right now, was different. It wasn't just about her. It was about something larger, something deeply ingrained in the very fabric of society. "I'd like to make a phone call," Sarah said, her voice calm and controlled. Officer Mallory paused, his hand still gripping her arm as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had expected her to break, to beg, or to protest in anger. But instead, she was asking for something as mundane as a phone call. His grip tightened slightly, but he was clearly unsure of what to do next. "Make a phone call?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You think you're going to call someone and get out of this?" Sarah didn't flinch. She had been trained to remain composed under pressure. "Yes," she answered. "I need to make a call. You're well past the point of a routine stop. This is now a matter of national security." The words hung in the air, and Mallory hesitated. He had no idea who he was dealing with. To him, Sarah was just another woman on the side of the road. He hadn't even bothered to read her ID properly, to verify her military credentials. But the name, the rank, and the subtle power in her voice were starting to dawn on him. "You're not going anywhere until we figure this out," Mallory snapped, trying to assert control over the situation, though the power dynamic was rapidly shifting. He waved over another officer, signaling to take Sarah to the patrol car. But Sarah wasn't backing down. She had made up her mind. She wasn't going to allow this officer's incompetence to define her. Nor would she allow his bigotry to go unchecked. She knew exactly who to call. With a coolness that surprised even herself, Sarah reached for her phone. Her fingers dialed a number she had memorized long ago. The phone rang twice before a calm, steady voice answered on the other end. "Pentagon Command Center. How can I assist you?" "Colonel Sarah Ellis," she said, speaking clearly and firmly, her words clipped with military precision. "I'm being detained by the Kingsford Police Department on Highway 94. Southbound marker 212. Officer Mallory has failed to verify my identification and is attempting to arrest me without cause. Please alert the proper authorities and mobilize support. Full status verification is required." The voice on the other end didn't flinch. It was as if her words weren't just routine. They carried weight, and they made an immediate impact. "Understood, Colonel. Please hold the line for a moment while we verify your request." For a brief moment, Sarah looked up. The helicopter she had noticed earlier was now circling above them, the hum of the rotors unmistakable. It wasn't the sound of a news crew or an emergency responder. It was the unmistakable sound of military precision. Her call was already being processed, and within minutes everything would change. Officer Mallory, still standing by Sarah's car, seemed increasingly uncomfortable. He glanced around, realizing that the crowd had grown. Phones were aimed in their direction, cameras were rolling, and the attention was no longer on Sarah alone. People were starting to whisper. The presence of the military-grade helicopter had added an undeniable sense of seriousness to the situation. As Sarah continued to speak on the phone, she could feel the shift in the atmosphere. She wasn't just a civilian being harassed on the side of the road anymore. She was a high-ranking military officer, and this was not just a traffic stop. This was a wake-up call for the officer, one he wouldn't soon forget. She could see the tension in his posture now, his movements more hesitant, his arrogance faltering. The minutes felt like hours, but finally the call ended. As Sarah hung up, she felt the shift in the air again, like the calm before a storm. Her pulse was steady, her body poised, but she knew that this moment would not pass quietly. A few moments later, a black SUV appeared on the horizon, racing down the highway. It pulled into the lot, its tinted windows reflecting the sunlight as it came to a stop. The doors opened simultaneously and soldiers in full military gear stepped out, moving in perfect formation. Behind them, a stern-faced woman in a sharp military uniform stepped forward. She didn't need to introduce herself. The officers could see her insignia from a distance. She was Colonel Teresa Maddox, and she was the kind of person who didn't need to speak loudly to make her presence known. "Which one of you is responsible for detaining General Sarah Ellis?" she asked, her voice clear and commanding, leaving no room for hesitation. Mallory froze. He turned to face her, a deep sense of dread sinking in. This was no ordinary officer. This was someone who could bring down the full weight of the military machine on him, and he knew it. I was just doing my job," he stammered, his confidence long gone. Colonel Maddox's gaze never wavered as she approached Sarah. "Are you all right, General?" Sarah's expression softened slightly. "I'm fine. Just waiting for someone with common sense to arrive." With a small key, Colonel Maddox quickly unlocked Sarah's cuffs. The moment they came off, Sarah straightened up, her body regaining its natural poise, but her mind still sharp with the knowledge that this injustice wasn't just about one encounter. It was part of a much larger issue. "Thank you, Colonel," Sarah said softly, though her voice carried a weight of authority that only years of service could provide. As Mallory stood frozen, now completely aware of the gravity of his mistake, Sarah turned to leave, the air around her thick with the silence of accountability. The military's intervention had already turned the tide. This was far from over for Officer Mallory, and Sarah knew it. As Sarah watched Officer Mallory stand frozen in front of her, his arrogance completely shattered, she knew the moment had come for the tide to turn. She had done everything by the book, remaining calm, never resorting to anger or violence. But now the reality of the power dynamics at play was clear. Officer Mallory had thought he could treat her as just another civilian, someone whose status and rank could be disregarded. But he was wrong. Sarah Ellison wasn't just any woman on the side of the road. She was a military leader, and today the system was about to take notice. Once Colonel Maddox had arrived and Sarah's cuffs were removed, it was evident that the game had changed. The officer who had initially detained Sarah seemed to shrink under the weight of his own mistakes. He looked around, realizing for the first time how many eyes were on him. People who had been passing by, bystanders, and even a few other officers had all witnessed the events unfold. Phones had captured every moment, the injustice, the humiliation, and Sarah's unshakable composure. It was now on public record, and there was no turning back. Despite his nervous stammering, Officer Mallory still couldn't fully comprehend the magnitude of his actions. He had simply seen a black woman, dressed in military garb, and assumed she was either a criminal or someone who didn't deserve respect. What he didn't know was that this was a woman who had sacrificed decades of her life for her country, one who had faced down far more dangerous situations than a roadside traffic stop. Sarah didn't need to prove herself to anyone, and she certainly wasn't going to let an officer's bias determine her worth. As Colonel Maddox and Sarah exchanged a few brief words, Officer Mallory made the mistake of trying to justify his actions one more time. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, still grasping for any excuse that would alleviate the weight of his mistake. "You weren't doing your job," Colonel Maddox's voice cut through the air with chilling precision. "You were abusing your power." With the military support now in place, Mallory knew his window of escape was closing rapidly. The officers, who had been present in the background, began to step forward, signaling the end of this chapter. This wasn't just a matter of one officer's failure to follow protocol. It was a larger issue of racial discrimination and abuse of power that had played out in front of dozens of witnesses. The crowd, which had been a mix of curiosity and skepticism, had now become a collective force. Phones continued to capture every detail. Some spectators began to murmur, expressing their outrage at the blatant injustice they had witnessed. For many of them, it was a moment of reckoning, seeing firsthand the kind of systemic racism that continued to exist in their society. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. It was about power, prejudice, and the way the system had treated black individuals for generations. As Sarah got into the military vehicle, her mind shifted to the bigger picture. She had been fortunate. She had a network, connections that would ensure her safety, her voice, and her dignity were restored. But she knew that many others weren't as fortunate. She was a general, a high-ranking officer with years of service in the protection of the military and federal systems. But what about the countless other black men and women who didn't have that same level of support? What would have happened to them if they were in the same situation? The thought weighed heavily on her heart. The next steps were clear. The footage from the incident would spread quickly, and the media frenzy would soon begin. But Sarah had no intention of allowing this moment to be about her personal plight alone. She knew that this was the perfect opportunity to bring attention to the wider issue of racial profiling, police misconduct, and the blatant abuse of power in law enforcement. "Make sure this gets out," she said to Colonel Maddox as they pulled away from the scene. "This isn't just about me. This is about what happens every day to people who don't have a platform to speak for themselves. And speak she would. In the days that followed, Sarah's story would spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the footage, reporting on the injustice. The video of her calm, unwavering demeanor during the entire incident went viral. And with it, the world got a glimpse into the reality faced by Black individuals in this country, especially those in positions of power, like Sarah herself. But Sarah wasn't done. She would use this moment not only to seek justice for herself, but to fight for a system overhaul. She knew the challenges ahead would be immense. Officer Mallory's actions were just the tip of the iceberg, and it would take more than just his termination to truly change the system. She would push for law enforcement reforms, mandatory de-escalation training, anti-bias programs, and better protections for military personnel off base. As Sarah sat in her office preparing her statement for the press, she didn't feel anger, but a sense of resolve. The battle was far from over, but today she had won a small victory. It wasn't about revenge, it was about responsibility. The responsibility of ensuring that no one, no matter their race or rank, should ever have to endure the kind of humiliation she faced on that road. It was about giving a voice to the voiceless and making sure that justice, real justice, was served. The days that followed Sarah's roadside detainment were a whirlwind. The media storm, which had been ignited by the video captured by a bystander, had spread across the nation. News outlets, social media platforms, and advocacy groups picked up the story. It was hard to escape the viral footage of Sarah's calm and dignified presence as she stood handcuffed by Officer Mallory, her face pressed against the hood of her Jeep, while the officer failed to even glance at her military identification. The footage was impossible to ignore, and the public's outrage was palpable. But for Sarah, this wasn't just about going viral. This was about turning a moment of injustice into an opportunity for lasting change. She knew that as a high-ranking officer in the military, she had the rare privilege of being able to make her voice heard and use her platform to fight for others who didn't have the same resources or support. She was determined to take advantage of the moment, not to settle scores, but to make sure that her experience would lead to meaningful reform. Within hours of the incident, Sarah was contacted by several human rights organizations. They wanted to meet with her, strategize, and figure out the next steps to push for police accountability and systemic change. But Sarah wasn't ready to make a public statement just yet. She had a plan, and she needed to execute it carefully. She reached out to her trusted allies within the military, including Colonel Maddox and Captain Miguel Herrera, to discuss how they could use their combined influence to bring about real change. The first step was securing justice for herself. She knew that Officer Mallory needed to be held accountable, but she also knew that this was not just about one officer's failure. It was about the larger issue of racial profiling, systemic racism, and the disproportionate treatment of Black individuals in law enforcement. Sarah had no illusions about the road ahead. She understood that the public outrage would die down eventually, but if they didn't act quickly, the moment would pass, and those who had failed her would face no consequences. Sarah made a call to the Department of Justice, making sure that the investigation into Officer Mallory's actions wasn't just a slap on the wrist. She was clear, this wasn't about one rogue officer. This was about an entire system that needed to be overhauled. The next few days were filled with meetings, calls, and briefings. She worked with legal teams, advocacy groups, and politicians to craft a policy proposal that would address the root of the problem. It was called the Ellison Protocols, a set of reforms aimed at addressing racial bias, improving de-escalation training, and instituting mandatory military verification for officers who interact with service members in civilian settings. As she worked behind the scenes, Sarah's personal life began to shift as well. She found herself invited to speak at schools, community centers, and even congressional hearings. The media had turned its attention to her, but she wasn't looking for fame or personal gain. What she wanted was change, and she knew that change wouldn't come from her silence. It would come from the conversation she was starting to drive. At one such community event, Sarah stood in front of a group of young students, Black and brown kids from the inner city. They had been following her story, and they were eager to hear her speak. One of the first questions that came from the crowd was, "Were you scared when the cop pulled you over?" Sarah took a deep breath, remembering the long walk that had led her to this point. She could have told them that she was scared. Everyone would have understood. But instead, she chose to say something different. I wasn't scared, but I was steady. I've been afraid before, and I've learned that fear can't speak for me. The response was met with silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that followed a powerful statement, one that stayed with everyone who heard it. Sarah was teaching these kids something far more important than military strategy or how to command troops. She was teaching them how to stand tall in the face of injustice and to speak truth to power. Back at her office, Sarah was preparing for her first official public address. The media had been relentless, but she wasn't going to let them control the narrative. The room was filled with reporters, cameras, and people eager for her to say something they could turn into a headline. But Sarah wasn't going to let this be a one-off statement. She had more to say, and she would say it in her own time, her own way. She stepped up to the podium, her uniform sharp and pressed, medals gleaming in the lights. She cleared her throat and began, I'm not here to seek justice for myself. I'm here to make sure this never happens again. To anyone. Not just for black men and women in the military, but for every black person who's ever been unfairly targeted because of the color of their skin. It was a powerful statement. But Sarah knew that this would be the beginning of a long journey. Her work had just begun. With the Ellison protocols and the growing support from communities across the country, Sarah was pushing forward. She wasn't just fighting for her own dignity, she was fighting for every black person who had been silenced, marginalized, or ignored by a system that was supposed to protect them. And as Sarah walked out of that press conference, she knew that she had already started to change the world. In the aftermath of Sarah's high-profile detainment, a profound shift began to ripple across the nation. The media storm, initially focused on the shocking video of Sarah's humiliation, had sparked something deeper. It was no longer just about one officer's misconduct. It had become a symbol of the broader, more entrenched issues of racial profiling and police misconduct. Sarah's actions, calm yet forceful, turned her from an ordinary military officer into a beacon of hope for those seeking justice and reform. The public outcry was deafening. People across the country, especially from marginalized communities, rallied behind her. Activists, political leaders, and ordinary citizens alike saw Sarah as a representation of how even those in positions of power could be victimized by systemic injustice. However, Sarah knew that media attention was fleeting. The real work lay ahead in ensuring that this wasn't just a momentary headline, but the beginning of a long-term fight for change. Within weeks, the Ellison protocols gained traction. It wasn't just a proposal anymore. It was becoming a movement. Legislative hearings were held, with Sarah called to testify in front of lawmakers who were finally starting to listen. Her testimony was clear and compelling, as she spoke not just about her experience, but about the need for structural reform. It's not just about what happened to me, she told the room. It's about ensuring that no one else, regardless of their position, experiences this kind of treatment simply because of their race or background. Her call for mandatory de-escalation training for police officers, enhanced racial bias training, and a rigorous system of verification for military personnel interacting with law enforcement was gaining support across party lines. Public opinion began to shift, with increasing calls for accountability in policing, and the Ellison protocols quickly became the centerpiece of the conversation. The impact of Sarah's case didn't stop with policy reforms. It touched the very core of law enforcement practices, making departments across the country reassess their approach to policing and the training officers received. Her story was a stark reminder that power, when abused, doesn't just hurt individuals. It erodes trust in the institutions that are supposed to protect the public. Despite the growing movement and public outpouring of support, Sarah knew the battle was far from over. The system was not going to change overnight, and there would undoubtedly be resistance from those who were comfortable with the status quo. But Sarah was resolute. She continued to speak out, using her experience as a platform to advocate for justice, accountability, and the dignity of all people, regardless of their race or status. In her heart, she knew the fight wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had ever been treated unfairly, for every person who had ever felt powerless against a system that was supposed to protect them. She was not just advocating for the military or law enforcement, but for the soul of the nation itself. This was just the beginning, and Sarah was ready to lead the charge toward a more just and equal future. As Sarah's story continued to unfold, the impact was undeniable. What had started as a personal battle against an unjust detainment had transformed into a national movement, one that demanded a fundamental reckoning with the realities of racial profiling and systemic police misconduct. Sarah's ability to remain poised even when being mistreated resonated with many who had faced similar injustices but lacked the platform or resources to fight back. The video of Sarah's detainment went viral almost immediately, spreading across social media platforms and news outlets alike. Within days, it was a topic of heated discussion across the nation. The images of Sarah, a decorated military officer, handcuffed and pinned against her own vehicle, became a symbol of the racial injustice that still pervaded many corners of American society. People who had never before considered the depth of these issues were now paying attention. The video didn't just show an isolated incident of police overreach, it revealed a pattern of behavior that had long been hidden beneath the surface of daily life. What was perhaps most remarkable about Sarah's response to the incident was how she took ownership of the situation, not out of arrogance, but out of a deep sense of duty. As she said in her press conferences, "This isn't about me. This is about ensuring that no one, regardless of their position, should ever be treated like this again." Her words weren't just a plea for justice for herself. They were a call for accountability on a systemic level. Sarah had known from the beginning that the road ahead would be difficult, but the support from the public and the media was undeniable. It was clear that the tides were turning. Within weeks of her arrest, lawmakers began taking action. The Ellison Protocols were drafted and debated in Congress. The protocols proposed strict regulations for law enforcement when interacting with military personnel, particularly those with rank or those actively serving. One of the main provisions included mandatory verification of military status and a reevaluation of how officers were trained to engage with people from all backgrounds. The political momentum continued to build, with public protests and calls for action becoming louder. Sarah's personal story also sparked deeper conversations about race in America. Her calm demeanor during the ordeal and her powerful testimony in front of Congress helped to humanize the issue for many people. Her actions showed that while rank and status could provide some protection, they were no guarantee against the realities of racial profiling. Despite her military rank and years of service, Sarah had still been subject to the same discriminatory assumptions that many others faced. As the media continued to cover the story, Sarah's name became synonymous with the fight for justice. She was invited to speak at various events, both public and private, where she used her platform to challenge systemic injustice and advocate for broader societal change. The message she sent out was clear. The fight was not over, and it would continue until true equality was achieved. With her increasing public presence, Sarah began to feel the weight of her role not just as a military leader, but as a symbol of resilience and resistance against oppressive forces. But she also knew the weight of the journey ahead. Change would not come easily or quickly, but Sarah was prepared. Her strength, her commitment to justice, and the support of the people who rallied behind her kept her moving forward. As Sarah's legacy unfolded, it was clear that her fight had already begun to change the way people thought about power, race, and justice in America. And while her personal battle had been won, her work was far from finished. The new fight for real, systemic change had only just begun, and Sarah was at the forefront, leading the charge for a more just and equitable future. The days that followed Sarah's powerful statement and the widespread media coverage of her detainment saw a whirlwind of legal and personal consequences for the officers involved. As the news of the incident spread, internal investigations were launched. The police department, previously trying to downplay the severity of the situation, found themselves under immense pressure. Law enforcement officials who had initially brushed off Sarah's treatment as a routine stop now had to confront the overwhelming evidence of misconduct. Officer James Calloway, who had been the one to initially approach Sarah and escalate the situation, was placed on administrative leave as the investigation began. His actions were scrutinized not just by his department, but by the public. Sarah's ordeal had awakened a national conversation about racial profiling, especially when it involved military personnel who were already in uniform, showing respect for authority. Many saw it as yet another example of how people of color were treated differently, even in circumstances where they held high status or were part of a respected profession. But the consequences for Officer Calloway were swift. Within weeks, he was dismissed from the force. The news of his firing was picked up by every major outlet. The department's Internal Affairs Division made it clear that his actions were unacceptable, and the disciplinary action served as a warning to others who might consider abusing their authority. However, for many, this was just the beginning. Sarah's case wasn't just a matter of one bad officer. It was a glaring indication of a larger problem within the law enforcement system. As for Sarah, the emotional toll of the entire ordeal began to show, even if she kept up a strong front. She had done the right thing, but the weight of knowing how close the situation had come to escalating into something far worse was heavy. The public acknowledgement of her strength, however, did not shield her from the internal battles she faced. Her sense of justice, combined with her years of military training, had always told her that standing up against injustice was a duty. But this wasn't just about standing up. It was about making sure that systemic change happened to prevent this from happening to anyone else in the future. The process was slow and the path ahead was long, but Sarah had become more than just a victim in this case. She had become a leader, a voice for those whose cries for justice often went unheard. As Sarah sat in the quiet of her home, she reflected on the events that had unfolded in the past few weeks. The whirlwind of media attention, the public outcry, and the internal investigations had all created an atmosphere charged with change. However, even as the dust began to settle, Sarah knew that this incident would have a lasting impact, not just on her, but on the entire community. What struck her most was how quickly her situation had become a symbol for something much larger than herself. In the days following her statement, many people from all walks of life reached out to express their support. Some shared their own stories of racial profiling and injustice. Others expressed their gratitude for her courage in speaking out. Sarah had always believed in the power of leadership and taking responsibility for the greater good, but she had never imagined that her own experience would catapult her into the role of a spokesperson for change. In private moments, though, Sarah found herself grappling with something deeper. It wasn't just about justice in that single encounter. It was about something much more profound. As a Black woman, she had fought for years to prove her worth, her competence, and her ability to lead. Yet even with her rank, her experience, and her accomplishments, she had been reduced to a suspect based on assumptions about her race. That realization stung deeply. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about a system that had conditioned so many people to disregard her humanity and dignity. Sarah understood that this was not just about her fight. It was about the fight of countless others who didn't have the same platform or protection she did. She had the military power to call the Pentagon, to demand action, and to hold people accountable. But so many others, mothers, fathers, teachers, students, didn't have that privilege. The system that failed her in that moment had been failing them too. Despite the hurt, Sarah found strength in the fact that her story had ignited a larger movement for accountability. She was part of something bigger now, a growing call for transparency, sensitivity training, and racial equity in law enforcement. And though there was still much work to be done, she knew that her actions had made a difference. The law had failed her in that moment, but in the end, it had also been forced to reckon with itself. As Sarah prepared for her next steps, she realized that her journey was far from over. There would always be more to do, more to fight for, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. The day of the press conference arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. Cassandra stood backstage, her mind sharp and focused, as she waited for the moment she would step out in front of the cameras. The whole nation was watching, an unprecedented opportunity to speak out, not just for herself, but for everyone who had suffered from similar injustices. She had been through battles in far-off lands, leading troops in combat, negotiating with enemies in tense, high-stakes environments, and yet nothing had prepared her for this. In that moment, it wasn't just about military tactics or political maneuvering. It was about justice, dignity, and the fight for equality in the face of deeply entrenched systems of oppression. As the cameras flashed, Cassandra walked confidently to the podium. There were no theatrics, no grand military salute, no entourage. She was there as herself, a woman, a general, a black woman who had earned every ounce of respect she had received, but who was still reduced to suspicion because of the color of her skin. She took a deep breath and began speaking. "My name is Cassandra Ellison," she said, her voice strong yet calm. "I am a daughter, a sister, a soldier. I have served this country for 26 years, led troops into combat, negotiated with foreign leaders, and carried wounded soldiers across battlefields. And last week, I was handcuffed on the side of a Georgia highway. Not as a criminal, but because someone decided my skin was a greater threat than my 3 stars." The room fell silent. Her words pierced the hearts of many, resonating with the deep, underlying pain of years of racial inequality that many had tried to ignore. She continued, explaining that the issue was not personal. It was systemic. "I don't stand here today to shame an individual officer," she clarified. "I stand here to reveal a system where a decorated black woman can be stopped, humiliated, and detained because of her race, where service is acknowledged only when it fits a narrative, and dignity is conditional." Cassandra paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. "I will not beg for justice," she declared firmly, "because justice is not something that should be begged for. It is something that should be expected. It should be granted to all, no matter who they are or where they come from." The room was still, as if everyone collectively held their breath, processing the gravity of the moment. Cassandra was no longer just a soldier. She had become a symbol, a beacon of hope for many who felt powerless in the face of an unjust system. She wasn't asking for change. She was demanding it. As she finished speaking and stepped back, the crowd remained hushed. No applause, no cheering, just the reverberating truth of her words. The silence, however, was not one of sadness or despair. It was a silence of acknowledgement, of recognition that change was no longer a possibility. It was a necessity. Later, as she walked out of the Pentagon, the chanting began. A soft, steady chorus of voices filled the air, calling her name. She didn't need applause. This was the beginning of real change, and for the first time in a long time, Cassandra felt that maybe, just maybe, the world was finally listening. The aftermath of Cassandra's press conference reverberated across the nation. Her words didn't just spark outrage, they ignited a movement. The video of her being detained had already gone viral, but now it was clear that this incident was about much more than a single officer's misconduct. It was a stark example of a broken system, one that allowed for racial profiling and discrimination, even against those who had sacrificed so much for their country. In the days that followed, public pressure mounted. Protests erupted in major cities, demanding justice not just for Cassandra, but for all those who had been unfairly targeted because of the color of their skin. News outlets continued to cover the story extensively, with many highlighting the broader issues of racial bias in law enforcement. For the first time in a long while, it seemed like the world was ready to have the hard conversation about race and power. Within 48 hours, Cassandra's call for accountability reached Capitol Hill. Legislators were forced to act, spurred by the undeniable truth that had been presented to them. A bipartisan bill was introduced to address the systemic issues in law enforcement: mandatory de-escalation training, military verification procedures for active duty personnel, and recalibration programs aimed at addressing racial bias. Though it wasn't a comprehensive solution, it was a significant step forward. The bill would carry Cassandra's name, a testament to her courage in speaking out and demanding change. Meanwhile, Officer Brent Mallory, whose actions had set this chain of events in motion, faced an internal investigation. His dismissal from the Kingsford Police Department was swift and public, marking the beginning of consequences for his actions. But for Cassandra, the battle was far from over. She knew that one officer's punishment wouldn't change the system. And so she continued to push forward, determined to ensure that this moment wasn't just a headline, but the spark that ignited lasting reform. In life, there are moments when we are faced with challenges that test not only our patience, but our belief in justice and fairness. Cassandra's story serves as a powerful reminder that standing up against injustice, no matter how intimidating the circumstances, is crucial. It teaches us that our dignity and rights should never be compromised, regardless of race, gender, or status. In times of adversity, it's important to stay composed and unwavering, just as Cassandra did, showing that true strength lies in maintaining control over oneself. Her experience highlights the need for accountability and change within systems that may otherwise overlook these crucial values. As we grow older, it's natural to feel that our influence diminishes, but stories like this remind us that our voices still matter. We have the power to drive change, whether it's through standing up for ourselves or supporting those who need help. The fight for fairness is ongoing, and it's never too late to make a difference. If you've ever faced an injustice, no matter how big or small, remember that your voice can help pave the way for a better tomorrow. I encourage you to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Let's continue to support one another, speak out for what's right, and inspire the next generation to keep fighting for justice.